let's get to something before I know we have to talk about Raw and we have some other Vince McMahon news. Everyone's just acting like a fool lately. Let's talk about something we really need to get caught up on, Dark Side of the Ring.
Yes.
And the episode on Chris Adams, Gentleman Chris Adams.
Yes, because we hate it that we've been behind on some of these programs, and Dark Side has been keeping me sane here lately because you see Chris Adams, or we'll talk about in an upcoming program, a Sherry Martell that just aired, or we saw Chris Colt last week. It's not that the A&E shows have cross-pollinated to where they're telling the same stories about the same people with the same talking heads, and they blur, right? And as I mentioned, the Treasures has become, hey, let's go find this guy's fucking sweaty tights. But with Dark Side,
which is a notch down from, hey, let's have Top Dollar harass John Pantozzi.
Well, yes, at least they don't have Flop Dollar trying to fucking hornswoggle and bully people out of their legally collected items for this fictitious Hall of Fame that'll never take place. But nevertheless, Dark Side of the Ring is what we were talking about. And the episode on Chris Adams was just last week. And, that's when this came up, I realized Chris Adams doesn't get a lot of talk these days. And, his major league career was over well before the 90s, boom. And he was a big deal in the 80s because the World Class show was such a big deal, but it hasn't lasted on the YouTube nostalgia and the modern streaming, except for the Von Erichs and the Freebirds, rivalry, as much as the Saturday night TBS show or the Crockett stuff. You know what I'm saying? So you don't see this stuff over and over these days like you do with some of the other people. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
Well, thank you. And I got to admit, we knew Chris Adams for like 6 months. I'll talk about, personal interactions and or opinions here at the top, and then we'll talk about what was in the program. But, we knew Chris for like 6 months when Bobby and Dennis and I went to World Class in January of '85. And except for maybe, I'm trying to think a time or two, maybe when Watts was being absorbed or had been absorbed by Crockett. I can't remember where Adams was. We might have been in a locker room with him a time or two at that point. But I never saw him drunk because we didn't really, even then, Bobby and Dennis in a small territory with only, 7 or 8 heels or whatever, Bobby and Dennis didn't associate with Chris and Gino outside of the ring, outside of the matches, besides the fact that we felt somewhat like the outsiders when we came in. We've talked about World Class with the small roster. The heels were Gino Hernandez, Chris Adams, one-man gang, and they were figured in with the Von Erich family. Gary Hart, the manager, was figured in because he'd been Fritz's booker, and they went way back. And then the only other heels on the card were the Midnight, me, maybe at one point Rip Oliver or Kelly Kaniski, or 1 or 2 other guys.
Johnny Mantell.
Well, he was a babyface.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And like the babyfaces, besides the Von Erichs, you had Scott Casey and the Fantastics at one point, the Fantastics and Hercules, or Johnny Mantell. Brian Adidas was on the card, the Von Erichs' high school friend. So, point being, we weren't in that clique and had never been there, worked with those guys. And we had given our notice the first night in because we thought we were going to go work for Crockett's. They probably, were like, ah. But the thing is, Gino and Chris, that wasn't a gimmick. And now I can't speak to when Chris had come and was a babyface, but when Gino and Chris got together, Gino did live in Highland Park, the exclusive condo suburb type of thing. And they did go to all these parties and have these sports cars. And we were just, taking our $1,000 a week and waiting until we got the spot to go to work for Crockett. So we weren't in the same, nor did we want to be, the same social circles as Gino and Chris, but they were doing the whole big Dallas associating with the fast crowd type of thing. So I never saw that side of him. actually, he was kind of, on the side of overly polite for one of the boys in the locker room. When you were just sitting in the fucking high school gym locker room with him. As far as his work, you know what, that kick, boy, going back, and now that everybody has done it and it's just bullshit and meaningless,
It's still
his
the
fucking
best.
kick looked good, boy.
It's still the best. And you know what? I think it was David Manning who said it. David Manning, I always got a kick out of him, but the most overbearing referee you've ever seen.
Yeah, he had to be a baby face at all fucking costs.
He would get right in the heel's face and give it to them. But he said that Chris would slap himself and you never even saw it and you couldn't see it.
No.
Because I was looking for it after. I was like, you know what? I've never really noticed he slapped himself or not. Everyone else, you see it. You don't see it with him.
No, and also it was smooth and it looked good, and then they put it over and people just didn't, pop up. They definitely didn't stay up. They went down for it and they didn't get back up real quick. But having said that, his work looks better today than it did to me at the time because the quality of work has gone downhill so much in modern times. But so when you go back and you look, you say, oh shit, that guy was better than I remember. I'm not saying Chris wasn't a really good worker. I'm saying, and also it wasn't fair because we've talked about the rings being concrete in world class, but it was a habit that he and Gino both got into. When they took bumps like a backdrop, they'd put their hands down. It was poor form, but it was, for self-preservation, falling on stages most of the time. But as a promo, he was kind of bland as a baby face, but he had some fire. But as a heel, it was really good because he had the accent got heat in Texas. So, I think he was a very good worker, and he probably would have been a top heel the years after World Class in maybe anywhere but the WWF or Crockett Promotions, because they were just so loaded with talent. And but otherwise his shit stood up. And that was the thing in Dallas, is that those programs lasted so long because in other areas, other territories, there were multiple ways to get into the main events and multiple guys to work with to make money. But in World Class, it was only the Von Erichs and whoever worked against them. So the guys wouldn't let those spots go. So once that Gino knew the drill, and once that they switched Chris heel, and he was in with Gary Hart, that, okay, he's in the protected bubble, and they had the boy's ear and Fritz's ear, and they could do all kinds of shit. And that was the way you kept buying the sports cars in Dallas. But everybody else wanted to get the fuck out of there. But anyway, that was so, I was so surprised when all this happened in real time with him going crazy and headbutting people and then, whatever, because we just saw this fucking English guy that was a pretty good worker, and it didn't seem like he'd say boo to a goose, as Adrian might say. Did you ever meet Chris Adams? Were you even around him any time?
Never met him, never was around him, never saw him on a show. I was always a fan of his. World Class aired in the afternoons when I was a kid, when I was really getting into wrestling, every day on ESPN. So I got to see the glory days of it as like Dallas was falling apart. And then I got tapes. Love the stuff with him. I mean, he may be the best opponent for Kevin Von Erich just because they worked really stiff with each other, and that's just the way they were. It worked for me. I liked it. I was a big mark for that stuff. And then you'd see him in whatever Dallas stuff every now and then popped up on ESPN. You're always like, why doesn't anyone do anything with him? Even as a kid,
why is he there?
Why is he there? And then he popped up in WCW, but that was when they signed everyone, and a lot of names you knew from the 80s were there just to do jobs in 6 minutes.
Well, and then, in this program, we kind of found out why that Chris stayed in Dallas and the business moved on, because he was, getting further issues with alcohol and whatever, which is a recurring theme with a lot of these programs. But the talking heads were good. They had David Manning, James Beard, Jeannie Clark, Kevin, King Parsons, and Adams, his daughter, and his brother, Neil. His brother is just the most polite sounding, unassuming chap. And he was the fucking judo badass, right? Chris was good enough to get by, but Neil was the world-class ranked judo guy.
Yeah.
And, everybody says basically Chris was a Jekyll and Hyde. And another thing that this program highlighted to me was the short time, really, when you think about it, that Chris had at the top or in any money-making position in the business. It was glorious, but it was brief because he started in World of Sport, black belt Chris Adams, and met Jeannie and made her his valet. But when they moved to Los Angeles, he was out there with Adrian Street, and I think Tom Pritchard had just been there. That territory was near death. There was no money to be made whatsoever. And so he moves her and him to Los Angeles and is making no money. So he's got to go to fucking Mexico to wrestle. And she had to go back to the United Kingdom to have a baby. And then they all went back to the United States. But he's running around on her and not coming home for days. So you could there may be some red flags. But really, by the time that he got to Dallas in 1983, that would have been the first time he made any money in the wrestling business. And by 1987, it was over with. So that was, when you look at it in right in front of you, you're like, wow, he had a longer career, but he didn't have a real long window at the top. And you remember the debut footage of him in World Class when he came in, he had a crew cut because he'd got his head shaved in Mexico on the way out. And I think they glossed over really how big of a babyface that he became in the whole feud with Jimmy Garvin, and then the valets, Precious and Sunshine, and everybody getting involved. That was carrying that show right underneath the Freebirds and the Von Erichs for about a year and a half.
That was what put valets on the map as being something other than women who went to the ring, didn't say anything, didn't do anything.
Yeah. And everybody had to follow along with that, that motif that the girls have got to get in the cat fight, and there's got to be, a girl in opposing corners, and every company ran with that at some point or another during that time, but it was all from them. But did you love the comment from Kevin Von Erich about, well, Chris got in trouble because, you had to be early, or you had to be at all the shows an hour beforehand. You couldn't be late. I'm like, that is true. That is great advice, but coming from one of the Von Erichs. Oh,
if you're going to be late, it's better just to turn around and go home.
Well, when we got there, every week you'd get your booking sheet at Friday night at the Sportatorium for the following 7 days. And that was normal that once a week at a set of place, anytime in a territory, you'd get your booking sheet for the next week. But with this would come little slips of paper that they had copied on a machine and scissored them, directions from Dallas to the spot shows. Not the towns we run every week, but the spot shows, the high school gym in McKinney, Texas, or whatever, right? And we'd never seen that before, because in those days, literally, you got the booking sheet. It said, be at this high school or this building in this town at 7:30. When you got into town, you stopped at a goddamn gas station and said, where's the fucking high school? That's how you found out. Written instructions. Well, this is great. And then Rick Hazard, one of the referees, told us the reason was because they didn't want to just give the Von Erichs written directions and not give the other boys to make, the boys feel bad. But if the Von Erichs were to go to a town and go to one school and find that the matches weren't there, they wouldn't ask if there's another school. They just think they went the wrong place. They turn around and go back home. So they give
that's just amazing
written directions from the office.
Hey, there's no wrestling show here. I'm gonna go get some chicken wings.
Yeah. So anyway, he turns heel pretty quick, does Chris Adams, in this television broadcast. And the heel team with the Gino Hernandez, the dynamic duo, and the feud with the Von Erichs. And, King Parsons had a story that they were bribing cops. And I believe it in Dallas at that point in time. It was insane what you could get away with being on that television. But he said that they would have the big party with the cocaine and the hookers and the whatever in the hotel room, and they just slip a couple of cops $1,000 a piece to watch the door. I believe it more of Gino than I do of Chris, but if Chris was around, that's the point. And, you could, when Gino died it was early in the year in 86, wasn't it? Wasn't it early?
February 86.
Yeah. So that was not a good year for World Class, but that was a record-breaking year for Crockett and the WWF. And, Watts was still expanding, but he couldn't really go anywhere because he was starting to get more fucked up and more people had stories. Manning says he super kicked the bartender in Israel. And, Von Erich tells a story about Chris choking the guy that drove him to the fucking matches. And then he got, on the plane and got drunk because they were delayed on the tarmac or whatever and got cut off and slapped the stewardess and headbutted the pilot. And that's 1987. That Crockett's still in business. But they're making no money in fucking Dallas, but Chris is going to jail instead of moving up in the world. So that's, go ahead.
Well, the couple of things. One is that's also when Dallas, 86 is when everything went to shit. They left the NWA, all of a sudden elevated the America's champion to being the NWA or being the world champion. Rick Rude was their world champion, remember?
Yeah.
Then Gino dies. Then Ken Mantell goes to work for Bill Watts and takes a bunch of the talent. Although you could say that they probably needed new talent. They didn't really, they refreshed like their Freebirds and all these people with Buzz Sawyer, Matt Bourne, different kind of wrestler. Then Kerry got hurt in a motorcycle accident. So now there was no Kerry Von Erich for, a year and a half?
Yeah.
No Kerry Von Erich. Lance is still there. Mike passes away, I believe, in 87. So you got one more year of that, so still more tragedies. Chris goes to jail or prison, whatever it was. And then he goes to work for Bill Watts. And they made him a babyface doing PSAs about, drinking. And that's when Iceman Parsons, who left World Class to go there too, turned on him and started calling him a jailbird. So you had the babyface who got drunk and beat up a flight attendant or whatever, and the captain being called names by the heel. And he had to be like, no, I've changed. I went to prison a few months ago. And that was it for a while. And then, in 88, when World Class had a little bit of a revival in terms of the quality, when the Freebirds went back in there, then they had the Freebirds versus Freebirds, where Michael Hayes had the concert, and he got attacked right before Kerry and Kevin were going to come out and sing with him. We never got to hear that. Kerry Von Erich singing with Michael Hayes.
Oh, that would have been a chart topper.
But Chris Adams versus Terry Taylor was one of the highlights of 88 in Dallas.
But they were making no money.
And then Chris Adams versus Steve Austin, same thing, one of the highlights. And they showed some great clips in this. Look at the crowd there versus the crowd in the Sportatorium in 83. It's dark. You can't see too far into the crowd. There's a reason for that.
Well, and the thing is, with when Chris Adams met Tony, his next wife, and they did the angle with Steve Austin, who Adams trained, and Jeannie, that was the last thing that the dying Dallas territory at that time was known for, and it got some interest. He was still in the middle of shit that could get interest, but nobody would book him because he was, as everybody said, Jekyll and Hyde.
And then when I was 13, he showed up in Memphis briefly in the summer of 93, and he had a feud with, and Tony was with him. He had a feud with Brian Christopher.
Fuck, I forgot about that.
And it was great, because Brian Christopher could really work, and he was working there, and he was young and not fucked up. And Chris Adams still had it. He didn't look as young as he used to, but he could still move in the ring. He could still do the super kick. And he could do a good babyface promo. We didn't even get to see him as a heel there. But he ended up being a good, kind of maniacal heel promo, too.
Now, did Tony lived up here in Kentucky? at one point for quite a while. Maybe that's why that they briefly came here. I'm trying to think of where she might have, but I remember hearing that. But nevertheless, and then that got screwed up. Apparently, the story is Tony and Chris were in a car having a fight and an argument, whatever. And Tony stopped the car on the interstate so a truck could run over him. And Chris beat her up so bad she needed facial surgery. And apparently that was that for that. And then they tell Kevin the story. Kevin Viner, I bet, didn't know that fucking story or didn't remember that story. And they told it to him, and he said, well, I'm embarrassed I said good stuff about him now. But, and then...
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, guys, very much for... I remember the story about Rod Price's wig getting ripped off.
I never knew it was intentional, actually. I knew the story about it happening in the ring, and I've heard about it happening a few other times.
Well, and I didn't know it was intentional either, and I didn't know he got 200 fucking stitches. And they said, we've never seen so much blood before. I thought it like a rib, he pulled the guy's fucking hairpiece off. But no, apparently pulled his goddamn head off with it.
Pulled the scalp off.
Would it 200 fucking stitches? Ooh. Wouldn't you need to get a stick of some description and go have a talk with that motherfucker if it was on purpose? And you looked like Rod Price?
Yeah, Rod Price was a big fucking... I mean, back then, too, when he was younger, he was a big fucking guy.
Yeah. Well, apparently, I guess he was scared of Jekyll and Hyde.
Should have called Billy Jack Haynes. Got him in there to back him up.
Jekyll and Hyde meet Briggs and Stratton. I'd have run over him with a fucking truck if he was such a badass. But anyway, and like you said, at that point, WCW, they use him as a job guy because they signed everybody, but it was pretty much done at that point. He moved in with the fellow named Boo Ray, who was kind enough to pay for everything and, let Chris live in his house and get fucked up, I guess. But Boo Ray looked like a trailer park version of a Doobie Brother.
You ever see the Miz's dad when he appears on Raw?
Thankfully, no.
He looks just like the Miz's dad. It's scary.
Ooh. Well, have we had Boo Ray do a DNA test?
They didn't explain how you get the name Boo Ray.
It's a common name down south.
It is?
Actually, it is, unfortunately, in some circles. Hello, Boo Ray. But anyway, so apparently then, to repay Boo Ray, it's not that I mean to laugh about people's tragedies, but at this point, I've seen so many of these programs, I'm like, at some point, somebody might have said, maybe I'm headed down the wrong path in life. But Boo Ray, his kindness in letting Chris Adams live with him for free is rewarded when Chris meets a new girl and brings her to Boo Ray's house, and Boo Ray goes to bed, and Chris and the girl both overdose on GHB, and the girl ends up dying in his fucking house, even though the Chris was scared to call 911 because they were obviously going to get in trouble. And there you go. So, of course, that was a manslaughter charge. Did they even, I guess it never had time to get adjudicated as to whether he might have been guilty in that or not, because then they're back at Boo Ray's house and Adams gets drunk and jumps on Boo Ray, and Boo Ray tries to wound him, but shoots him in the heart. Even though the only intelligent, reasonable human being in the whole fucking piece here, Chris Adams' brother Neil, doesn't buy the self-defense scenario.
But there's no reason not to. I mean, he was a violent guy. You have to admit that.
Well, that's why I'm saying that of all people, the only person that looked like, came off like a goddamn human being that you would park your car near under any circumstance, and he's the one that doesn't believe it was self-defense.
Jeannie Clark, too. I like Jeannie Clark.
Oh, okay, I forgot about Jeannie. But otherwise, yeah, but no, it had to, because he just went nuts again and was trying to kill this fucking guy for what apparent reason we don't know. But apparently the guy didn't have time to take careful aim on that. It just give him a flesh wound. Boom! And that's all she wrote, as Mama Cornette used to say.
And it was weird too, because then they go to the Blu-ray interview and he's like, "Oh, Chris was the nicest guy in the world. I loved him. I just thought he was the greatest.
Hated that I had to kill him before he fucking murdered me."
See, I hate to laugh.
Yes, but you can't not. You can't not. We're in a world of self-defense, murdering, and head shitting. How can we not fucking laugh sometimes? But anyway, yeah, Chris Adams could have been was a star in exactly pretty much one United States territory and got over like $1 million and then never really got a chance to, because of his own various issues, go anywhere else and do anything else for the next 15 years.
Would Gino and Chris have fit in with Crockett Promotions in '86 if they had to have a place to go after World Class and they didn't go to Watts?
I was, again, I think Chris proved that he would go when he went to Mexico and moved to California, blah, blah, blah. He would pursue his dream. I think Gino would have been either offended at or just, fuck this, the schedule that Crockett had, and there were so many good heels. And, Tully was the kind of guy that was going to make the Crockett schedule and work hard and be on top. Gino, I don't know if he wanted to give up that much of his private life where he could go hang out with celebrities. And when you put Chris and Gino up against, the Midnight Express, either version, yeah, they had the top spot in Dallas because they were already there and they were figured in, but they couldn't, they would have been a competent, quality heel team pretty much anywhere, but would they have been on top or been able to manage that schedule for Crockett? And I don't think Vince would have. Gino didn't have a body and wasn't going to get one. And Adams was an athlete, but wasn't a bodybuilder. And I don't know if they'd like that schedule. Although Gino would have loved hanging out with the rock and roll stars. He might have done it for that. So, there's those caveats.
Well, that was the Dark Side of the Ring episode on Gentleman Chris Adams. And what I think we'll do, and correct me if I'm wrong, we'll talk about the Sherry Martel episode on The Experience.
Yes.
And we still have the Harley Race episode at some point we got to get caught up on.
That we got to go back and catch up on. And I saw that they're looking for Dusty's trunks. Maybe they found his muffler in that box also. But that was an episode that I haven't seen yet. And I'm going to, because it's Dusty, I want to give that a chance. But
his muffler, maybe that's what The Rock gave Cody and said, "Don't disappoint me again."
Yes. And then Cody went back and washed his hands with Bon-Ami. But yeah, there's so many programs. And we and questions and songs and dances and games and puzzles.